So we're going to talk tonight about how to share AI's future wealth. We're going to talk about UBI programs, and we're going to probably get pretty into the details of what are different ways to design them and which of those work and what do we know about what works and what doesn't. I'm Kelsey Piper. I'm a journalist. I write for The Argument. You guys go ahead and give a little bit about yourselves before we get into this.
Sure. My name is Caitlin Tulloch. I'm the Senior Director for Research at GiveDirectly, but more broadly, an economist focused on the cost effectiveness of different interventions to address global poverty.
I'm Nick. I am the CEO of GiveDirectly.
I'm Saffron. I am on the societal impacts team at Anthropic, and we're empiricists, so we basically try and find evidence for how is AI actually impacting people.
When AI was a little bit more of some future speculative stuff when I was in college 10 years ago, but people were already talking about like, oh yeah, and once we've automated all jobs, what are we going to do next? And I think the good outcome was always imagined as, yeah, we'll do something like a UBI. We will redistribute the wealth that we have created. Everybody will be able to spend their time however they like and do stuff like that. You also don't actually have to wait for a post-scarcity future to do this. And in a lot of ways, from the perspective of 1900, like we are in the post-scarcity future. We've been doing this. And any way I characterize these results is going to be very loaded. Giving people money when they are very poor causes them to not die. That's fantastic. It causes them to have better lives in a lot of ways on every metric that you look at. Giving people who are already not poor money does a lot less, but that might just be because you're not giving them comparatively nearly as much money. I'm now probably, Caitlin and Nick can both correct me in a lot of detail on that. But this raises a bunch of questions about if you're trying to redistribute the gains from AI, what specifically are you trying to do? There is an insane range of proposals that could all fall into the very broad bucket UBI. So, all right, I don't know, what would you do? Go for it. I didn't warn them I was going to ask that. What would you do? Caitlin, you first.
I'm really hoping that my status as a researcher is going to allow me to be a little bit pedantic, and hopefully you all will find that charming. But when you look at the evidence on what giving people money does, you can kind of break it down into short-term things and long-term things. In the short term, it's really, really good, especially if you give people small amounts of money for long periods of time at helping them eat and access healthcare. And for a pretty big fraction of the world, that's actually where it's at. And so I think I'm a very bottom of the pyramid kind of focused person in that my utility function is largely run on babies not dying. And so helping people do the very basics is tremendously important to me. One of the things I'll say is that there's emerging research essentially on how much bang for your buck you get if you do that through giving people a little bit of money every month, every year for a long time, versus actually giving them a much larger amount of money that lets them develop their own income streams. And that kind of liquidity seems really good at doing things beyond just eating and accessing healthcare. And that's when you see people making productive investments, moving to areas where there may be more opportunity, moving to a city or something like that, making any other kind of investment. And I think the thing that is in favor of redistribution in this way is that people are just infinitely creative when we let them make those decisions. So something on that spectrum. I hope that's...
Yeah, totally reasonable starting point. Nick?
Yeah, my kind of step back 30,000 foot thing is when you look at what are the policy options that we have for solving different problems that arise through either technological transformation or labor market disruption or any number of things that I think many of us forecast as possible as a result of the kind of advancement of AI. There's a range of policy outcomes, a range of policy solutions that you could be looking at. But there's a lot that some form of cash has going for it. It's incredibly simple to administer. It's incredibly flexible, and to kind of build on what Caitlin was saying, who here has heard the idea teach a man to fish, you'll feed him for a lifetime. It's very intuitively attractive. But when you actually think about it for a second, what institutions would you each trust to identify exactly what you needed to learn and then teach you effectively what to do with it? Most of the kind of research that we see is that people don't need to be trained. They already know what they need to do. Often we're actually quite bad at training people to do things. So even if you could identify what they needed to be trained in, you're actually not going to be very effective at training them. And so when you give them some sort of access to capital, then the incredibly diverse things that they can do with it really unlocks quite a lot. And so that, I think, is very intuitively attractive as a policy option in the face of all of these, in the face of all of these things. I, like Caitlin, am kind of a bugbear of mine is a lot of the discussion around how is AI going to affect society, I think, is heavily concentrated on the global north, on rich economies. The amount of conversation that is about jobs in the US, it kind of drives me up the wall, because I think the risk is not labor market disruption here. The risk is that you have 800 million people still trapped in extreme poverty who are just going to be left behind because they're not even able to get on the kind of ladder to start with. And so at a time when we are, unlocking unimaginable wealth, the greatest concentration and growth of wealth in human history, the opportunity to make sure that people aren't left behind by the next kind of stage of the technological revolution, I think is enormous. And it's actually fairly affordable. There's economists put the estimate of how much it would cost to literally lift every single person in the world out of extreme poverty in the sub $300 billion range. Now that sounds like a lot of money, but when you think about just the market caps of companies in the AI space that have grown in the last 5-10 years, you're actually it's a pretty small proportion. And when you think about the amount of productivity that might be unlocked and the amount of economic value that might be unlocked by this kind of revolutionary technology, I am hopeful. There are some cynical parts of me that says this is going to be really hard, but this is a moment in which it's possible to not leave people behind.
Saffron. Sorry. Okay, I'm going to take the anti-cash stance just for interestingness on this panel. I think also zooming out a little bit, the way that I'm coming at this topic is I work in AI, I work on figuring out, what are the societal impacts right now and the future and what should we do about it. And I kind of started thinking about this a little bit because, seeing all of these tech CEOs put a lot of money into, kind of throw around the word UBI a lot, but also put a lot of money into UBI programs in Oakland or in, in the US, basically. And to me, as someone who is pretty uninformed in the space relative to you guys, actually very uninformed, I was oh, this seems not the right solution here. And it might just be, we're taking a policy solution that works very well in a different context and trying to apply it to global north AI automation or whatever it is, and it just works differently for reasons that I think we can get into. So I was sort of okay, the evidence is nah, but also it feels like a pretty unambitious idea, the idea that we are going to create this sort of unimaginable wealth potentially and sort of create abundance, and the thing that is going to happen is that we're going to sort of kind of cut everyone out of the economy and put them on a sort of the cynical part of me is it's sort of a floor, here's enough to live on or something, and people are going to just kind of have to hope that the payments don't decrease, they don't have much political leverage anymore because the government doesn't rely on their revenue in order to keep doing things. This is also a very extreme scenario of labor automation that I'm talking about, where maybe this is not even possible in the next X decades, but in the case that it is, I think it's worth thinking about, okay, do we have any policy tools that could do anything about this? And I was kind of oh, UBI seems a little bit unambitious. To me, it doesn't really address the root cause of the issue, which is that the wealth generating assets are owned by a small number of people, and that divide is just going to continue to go up if you don't spread ownership around. And it's politically quite sort of precarious, I think, and probably quite bad for democracy. So I kind of came across this idea of predistribution versus redistribution. And predistribution is this idea that we should try and spread out the wealth-generating assets around, or at least sort of give people more opportunity to earn a more equitable distribution of income ex ante, rather than like doing a lot more redistribution ex post. And this is for a bunch of reasons. It's more politically feasible. People just don't really like being taxed a lot. It requires moving less money around often, like putting more money into education and healthcare upfront so that people are more able to earn more income actually just costs less than redistribution. It seems to, for me, like get at the root of the thing a lot better. And so it's like, okay, what if we applied this idea of predistribution to AI? What would we need to predistribute now to sort of ensure a more equitable ownership, more ability to participate in this like flourishing, abundant AI future for as many people as possible? Part of it is skills and education, people being able to actually use these things to start businesses or to achieve their own ends. Part of it is like assets and productive assets, financial capital, things like that. But what I find really interesting about this group of people is I think, I haven't really spent a lot of time thinking, I have been thinking at it from a more sort of, I think, solving a slightly different problem, right? Like, okay, what are the policy tools we have to address AI-driven job loss? And a lot of it is thinking about the global north, partly because I think there's a lot, like knowledge work, there's a lot of knowledge work that AI is like more threatening knowledge work than it is threatening anything physical. There's a lot more knowledge work in the global north. And I think it's interesting when like the industries that people aspire to, like, knowledge work is sort of like the pinnacle of the type of job you could have. Like what happens kind of not just economically but culturally when that is much less available. So I think like I'm definitely thinking a lot more about like, relatively very privileged people who are knowledge workers. But I think those are also potentially the people that AI will threaten the most. In terms of benefits, I do think that we should really try and use AI to like benefit as many people as possible.
So did you have something there, Nick?
Yeah, just one thing that I think is like important is like this idea of UBI can mean many things, and I think when many people hear the word UBI, what they hear is a monthly payment forever to a universal population of some kind. That payment should probably be enough to kind of cover your basic needs. And I think one of the really interesting things about what you said, which I think actually is somewhat consistent with our experience of this, is we're running the longest running trial on UBI in the world right now. There are 3 wings to this trial. It's in Western Kenya. There is one set of communities that received a large lump sum amount of money. It's kind of the equivalent to 1 to 2 years worth of income all at once. So imagine you receiving somewhere in the range of $50,000 to $100,000, or the equivalent of that. Another set of communities took that same amount of money and then but dripped it out into monthly payments over the course of 3 years. And then the final set of communities received a small amount of money, a small monthly payment, and that's actually lasting for 12 years. And so we're 8 years into this trial, and we have the results from those first 2 wings of the trial. We're still kind of collecting the data on that third wing. And what it showed pretty unequivocally is that the people who received the money all at once versus dripped out over time outperformed on basically every indicator. Every single one of them. Like whether it's income generation, health outcomes, etc. And why is that true? And the reason is, and it speaks to what you were just saying, which is that they invested it productively. It didn't get eaten up in their daily budget. Instead, they were able to make the types of investments that, like, maybe it was in their education, maybe it was in starting a business, maybe it was in the types of things that allowed them to productively participate in an ongoing way. And so I actually think that as we get into some of these weeds, like this idea of UBI, I think can encompass many ideas. And for us as an organization, we've actually shifted more towards this model of like give one large one-time amount of money that catalyzes people, gives them the startup capital they need to then support themselves in an ongoing way. And I think there's actually quite a lot of alignment between that and your idea of predistribution.
Yeah, the thing that your article and what you just said made me think the most was I feel terrified of the world where the broad plan is like an ongoing transfer to most people on which they are reliant because of watching the destruction of USAID this spring. Like if the system is that we are giving out aid on an ongoing basis that people rely on for survival, and then somebody's like, well, we don't want to do that anymore, then they can stop. And so that does make me feel like whatever we are doing, I would like it to be a system where there's not some entity that has all of the wealth that is like sending out monthly checks. I do feel kind of nervous or dissatisfied or something, though, about like one time, especially if it's... So, okay, maybe we need to start discussing a specific proposal. Maybe Anthropic should give out shares. Sorry, I only pick on Anthropic because you're here. Everybody should give out shares in a potential future revenue in the event that they meet some insane benchmark, which a lot of people think they might. These wouldn't be like voting shares. These wouldn't be like have to do much with the traditional investment structure, but you can own it. It is a property right. It is enforceable. Maybe we should give those to everybody. I have a couple hesitations. One is most people have no idea what this is, and probably it is very easy for me to go around and saying, this piece of paper that is about a speculative sci-fi thing, can I buy it from you for $5? Do we want to ban that? Do we want to say it's non-transferable only until the future? Do we want to say it's non-transferable forever? And I don't want to make this a monologue, I guess. I'd be curious if you thought about that. And I'd be curious if you guys have thought about like how structured, like what structure works best for people.
I mean, okay, I can start saying something. I feel like, I mean, I think if there's, well, all these things, it's like the devil is in the details, and like how exactly do you actually give shares to who? Like to every, if we're saying like we want to benefit everyone, it's like how do you give a share to every single person in the world? Like we actually don't really have infrastructure for that. I don't really want to be scanning people's eyeballs. Actually, maybe we do have infrastructure for that now. Thank you, Sam Ullman. But I don't know. I think there's like some real logistical difficulties with that. I think, unfortunately, a lot of things are done on the national level, and like, for example, one idea that I think is cool is that in the One Big Beautiful Bill. Sorry, now I'm veering off. Well, I'm still kind of on the topic of shares, but in the One Big Beautiful Bill, Trump has this thing called Trump accounts, where every child born between 2025 and 2028 gets $1,000 seed money in that account from the government, and the parents can invest like $5,000 every year after that, and it grows. It's invested in a diversified fund of tracking U.S. stock index. And it grows tax deferred until they're 18. And I think that this is a pretty cool idea. This could end up tracking basically AI stocks if the S&P 500 basically just becomes AI companies. So maybe this kind of thing is the way to go. But it's still very small, like it's 1,000. But it kind of shows that there's some appetite to doing this in a hopefully sort of bipartisan way, which I think is cool.
So I will admit, actually, and I think this conversation about kind of how it's structured is actually really important from kind of a long-term economics perspective. I will be honest, when you said, having remembered the collapse of USAID, one of the things, I lived through that earlier this year, so it's very fresh to me. But one of the things when we're talking about who is it who, chooses how this money is reallocated, it's actually relatively harder, particularly if you're kind of, observing the rules, to completely end foreign assistance flows. And that hasn't happened, actually. It will be dramatically reduced, but it will not be gone because there is bipartisan consensus. And I think that's going to be one interesting thing where the wealth is explicitly in private hands or in corporations versus, like Norway has a sovereign wealth fund, but that's at the direction of the government and tends to make pretty good investments, and is then kind of within that structure where that, and national government is deciding what's going to be done with that wealth in the long term. So I think there's kind of two sides of this. One is this, like, in some sense, who gets to decide the answer to any of these questions that has a huge amount of power. And I would say the more people are involved in that, the slower it gets and the more painful it gets and all of this. But like, even as an economist, I'm very willing to say, I think actually like deliberative bodies that have some momentum is a good thing because it makes it harder to suddenly have this future where like, well, we're just cutting off the income stream. The other thing I would want to add maybe to what Nick was saying about like this spectrum of what people can do with cash or any form of redistribution really is like when you take the long view of economic development, what you see is not people who spend more in the same households and the same occupations and the same places they've lived their whole lives. What we describe long-term economic development as is like structural transformation of the economy. And so I think that's where maybe we could try and be a little bit more ambitious here, is to say, I'm not just giving people capital to start kind of any old business or to kind of sustain themselves month to month. What does it actually take? And I mean, this is the $1 million question for all of economics since like the Herod-Domar model was published in, I think, 1945. So I'm not going to be like, oh yeah, once we figure this out, we've got it sorted. But the framing of this doesn't just have to be like, how do we help people in the places that they are? But what is it that helps this process of structural transformation that has actually gotten a large fraction of the world to what would look to someone in 1900 like a post-scarcity society? And I think the interesting thing, as Nick says, like we've come up with a lot of really clever ideas about how to teach people to fish in the last 50 years. And when we study them, unfortunately, a lot of them really don't work as well as we thought. Some of them do. But this doesn't need to be a kind of either or thing. I think you can think about both the role that redistribution, predistribution plays and the structure that it's happening within simultaneously. And I mean, that's actually my read of a lot of the evidence and where we see the biggest impacts. It's not as though some kind of cash transfer is acting completely independently of the context in which it's happening. You see it having the greatest effects when there is an education system to which people can send their children to get more labor market skills, when there are roads that connect you to markets, and so you can actually make something that someone a reasonable distance away is going to buy. And so I think those things are interacting. We don't need to kind of boil it down too far. It gets harder, it gets more complicated, but I think that's just kind of table stakes for this.
So that all works in as much as we're trying to like smooth out people's individual, like maybe having lost something in the context of a big structural transformation. As long as that big structural transformation like has at the other side of it like economically productive work they can do for themselves from there, right? I'm a little worried that might not happen. Like it might happen. I'm a little worried it might not.
How would you define economically productive? Because, I mean, Ireland has a UBI program for artists, and actually they're a center of an incredible art scene that, one of the highest aspirations, I think, of humans is to have enough leisure time that they can do something that is absolutely productive in a human and meaningful sense, and that other people would pay money for, even if it's not producing, I don't know, meat and potatoes and AI models.
So I think I'm worried about the world we've ended up in if all of the things that people are doing and buying and selling are like totally disconnected from the parts of the economy that like produce all of the goods and all of the ability to use violence and all of the ability to enforce and make laws and stuff like that. Like, it seems like, I mean, maybe economically, non-economic isn't even the thing, but like not an input to the parts of the economy that have material power. That's where I feel like I'm scared.
And is the fear about like the kind of structures of power and democracy there and the kind of accountability and like social contract that exists? Like, what can you go to the next level?
Yeah, so I think some
Can we
of
also
it,
clarify what you mean? I don't think I caught that.
okay, sorry. So let's say that we have a system where we're giving people, maybe in the form of shares in the S&P 500, which have gone up enough to pay for their expenses, maybe in the form of monthly payments of some kind, maybe in the form of a one-time transfer payment, but they can like live off the interest, or they can use that money and the flexibility it gives them to do something, to retrain, to do whatever it is that they're doing that allows them to participate in the new economy. This works well if the difference between the current economy and the post-AGI economy is something like the difference between the 1900 economy and the 2025 economy. Those are ludicrously different from each other. Almost all of the jobs that people were working in 1900, we don't have anymore. If we suddenly got the population of 1900 America dropped on us, it would be a refugee crisis because they would all be trained for roles that we don't need them in, and we not know how to do and not have the skills to do the stuff we're doing. But fundamentally, the stuff we're doing is still like stuff that is important to the functioning of our society. If we all stopped doing it, everything would grind to a halt overnight. That is, I think, the source of a lot of our power. You can say it's democratic, and obviously our institutions are also a big source of our power. But I do think a lot of the source of our power is economic, in the sense that it comes from the fact that if we did not do our work, then everything grinds to a halt. It's very easy to imagine that that is not the shape of the transformation from 2025 to post-AGI. That the post-AGI world is not one where we all need a lot of retraining, but then we are still doing things that are crucial to the continued operation of society, but one where those are mostly being done by non-humans, and humans are... It's not that there wouldn't be lots for us to do. Like, I would happily, spend all my time writing stories that only 100 of my friends read, and did running the homeschool co-op much better and with a lot more resources, and raising kids and making art and all of that. But the thing I'm scared of is that if none of that and none of the stuff that any of those people that I'm doing it for do is actually essential to the functioning of the economy, that feels very precarious. And I don't know that, it feels less precarious if we have more rights on paper or like personally own our share of the means of production, stuff like that. But it feels fundamentally precarious.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's also another thing I found kind of weird about UBI as like a solution to job loss. That it's like, oh, well, we'll all just do other stuff. But then like something is like humming under our feet, that's the economy, that like we have no say in, and it's kind of shaping our lives in this sort of like we're sort of like detached from it and nobody's actually participating in it, but it's like our entire material reality. I think that's like very that's also quite weird and bleak. I mean, I think one potential answer to this is that like a bunch of people can go off and do like things that are fun and like interesting to them, but not necessarily like vital to the economy, like what you're talking about. But then also you can get a bunch of jobs that are like supervising AIs or something, and like that's really critical because you're like supervising activity at a much higher, like at a much larger scale, or directing activity at a much larger scale than you would now. What was my other thought here? Okay, I think I might have to come back to it. But that's like one thing that I thought about, because I was like, I just think it would be odd to build an economy for humans with human preferences with no human involvement also. And I would hope that we still have like a robust sort of supervision infrastructure. Oh yes, another thing is like, I think this is also why I think it would be, you know, you might have like the AI infrastructure that's like owned, like the, you know, the training of the foundation models or something that's like owned and overseen by relatively few, but you have potentially a lot of applications on top that are much more like bespoke and smaller and more able to have small businesses, if you will. And so like different people can have like different small businesses and they can get their AI agents to do stuff and or actually just like leverage less labor into like more returns or something like that. Oh, another thing I think would be great is if we had a shorter work week.
So
Yeah.
So I just don't care that much about this problem. Which is not to say it's not a problem.
But it's not the problem that you're motivated to be working.
And I just think that when we kind of look at the order of magnitude of the problems that we should be focused on solving, there are 800 million people in the world who have to make choices between eating more than once a day and like buying medication for a sick child. And maybe in 10, 20 years' time, there's going to be mass white-collar disruption. Cool. Welcome to the 19th, 20th century for blue-collar workers. Maybe desk workers are about to experience what call center operators in the Philippines are experiencing like right now. And I just think that it's a very hard, abstract, intractable problem to kind of forecast the future in a way that's like, what's the economy going to look like this? And we can. Like, I don't say that we shouldn't do it at all. I just think there's a very tractable problem to solve that I see get far too little attention, which is orders of magnitude more important on the kind of scale of human flourishing and suffering. And so it's hard for me not to be distracted by that when we kind of start forecasting into the future of will we find productive things to do with our time? And, we have some evidence that when people get access to resources and freedom, they don't turn into slobs who gamble and drink it all away. That they find creative endeavors, that they create entrepreneurial activities. And what's that going to look like? I don't know. But I have a lot of faith in human kind of capacity for ingenuity and also for ability to find meaning and ability to create. And so, yeah, I know that that's answering a slightly different question. So it might be kind of annoying.
Is it fair to say that it feels to you like the most important mistake we might make here is coming up with some kind of national level scheme for distribution and completely ignoring the fact that a lot of the people who are...
The default scenario, right?
Yes.
The default scenario here is that you get unimaginable wealth captured in maybe the US, maybe a few other kind of global north economies that are able to capture the upside of AI, essentially, either through manufacturing base or kind of technical talent. And a couple of things happen from there. Either that just drives productivity growth and those countries become unimaginably wealthy and there's not mass disruption and the economy adjusts in the same way that every other technical transformation has happened over the last thousands of years. And there's disruption along the way and so on and so forth. That's kind of plan A. Plan B is this time is different. But even then, there's still some post-scarcity society and oh no, we have to figure out what to do with our time. And there's kind of issues with democratic power and accountability and various things. And all of that is, I think, plausible. But all of that is defaulting to kind of capturing value at the kind of top of the chain. And I think the default scenario right now is that all that value is captured at the top of the chain. and that there's like extraordinary number of people, not just those in extreme poverty, actually, also the call center workers in the Philippines, the kind of pathways to middle income, manufacturing jobs, like things like this, which have over the last 20 years lifted billions of people out of poverty. Like those are the things that I'm like, I think that's what we should be stressed about.
And I'd love to jump in on that because I actually think there's like, what we're talking about is there's 800 million people, billion people. I haven't eaten dinner. You'll forgive me.
There's 800 billion people. We'd have some different problems.
Yes, thank you. Sorry, I was thinking in trillions today, and it throws me off. Yeah, we would have. Well,
I would be happy on the whole. I like humans. We would make it work. But we would have a lot to make work.
where I was going with that is I really like this comment at the beginning that like we essentially from the perspective of the 1900s live in a post-scarcity society. And a huge fraction of that is thanks to the Green Revolution. Green Revolution is this wonderful thing, happens in the 60s and the early 70s. There is exactly the same conversation that we're having now happening prior to that, which is going to be what if there's not enough resources and then all of a sudden this magical thing happens. We double maize yields in Mexico. We learn to export that technology to Bangladesh, to Pakistan, to India. And this problem just kind of goes away, except for the continent of Africa, where for some reason, the benefits of this immense technical leap forward were not made available to the systems and the people who live there. And I mean, I think that's both part of where we're at today, and there are still people who are left behind in their very basic food security for what is essentially a problem of distribution. There's a very famous scholar of famine who has made the point that since roughly 1955, all famines are man-made, but we still have famines. And I mean, honestly, I get into arguments with my husband about this, less so since he's learned that he's going to get into an argument. But he reads a lot of speculative sci-fi and would you post-scarcity society. And I also have a hard time believing in a future in which everyone is post-scarcity, because if we're in that world now and there's still 800 million people left behind, we've clearly missed something. And so I think maybe this is the parallel of what you're saying, but if on average we have solved poverty, but actually 800 million people are still left behind, we're not really in a post-scarcity society then. And I think the problems of distribution are, to me, significantly more interesting than the amount of aggregate wealth. And so I don't know if that means we need to dive a lot more into there seems to be a lot of presumption that people will use AI chatbots to improve their agricultural productivity, that they will use AI tutors to teach their children. I can share thoughts on evidence on any of these things, but we can't assume that because the average is this big, everybody actually has gotten some and is now post-scarcity. And to me, that would be I guess that's effectively what I do. I come from a world in which I have many, many opportunities, and what I choose to do is work on the distribution problem. But
so on a policy level, you travel back in time, you know everything except which stocks go up in the 1940s or whatever. Is there something we could have done differently going into the Green Revolution that would have made it such that we didn't currently have 800 million people living in poverty? Were there laws that we designed badly? Were there patents that we designed badly?
So I have spent a lot of time thinking about this because I spent a lot of time working on agricultural policy and what's cost effective for improving yields. And you're just stuck with this fact that average yields are 2 to 3 times higher in some countries than others. And it's been stuck that way since the mid 60s. As I understand it from asking real agronomists and people who spend all their time thinking about this, there's a couple of answers. One, and I'm going to tell you this detail not because I think you need to know about local ecosystems in Africa, but because I think it may almost come back to your point about small business kind of analogies. The amount of heterogeneity in microclimates, soil productivity, all of these things that determine agricultural yields is massively greater on the African continent than many other places in the world. And so the things that you can say, great, I have bred the very special type of maize that has twice as many yields and is drought resistant and all of that, and I can roll it across here and here and here, and it is simply not as effective in certain communities, certain microclimates. That's something so that's a technical failure, and I think speaks to this idea of how are you going to adapt AI to the actual problems that people have on the ground, not the problems we would think they have in the US or even working in Mexico or in Pakistan. I think the other thing, as I understand it, is at a certain point, it's either MacArthur or Rockefeller stopped funding Norman Borlaug to continue doing research. And so they did Latin American varieties. And if somebody actually knows more about this, you can correct me. But and then they did South Asian varieties. And at a certain point, the funding was cut. And they stopped doing the detailed, boring research work of breeding different kinds of locally appropriate, drought-resistant, climate-resistant crops. And I think that kind of comes back to this point also about how quickly the tap can be turned on and off, where we were successful largely in when you look at the amount of the grants that went into CIMMYT in those early years, the ROI in terms of human welfare is insane. And then somebody kind of just decided to stop. So I think there's two failures there. There's the idea that we're going to solve problems in the places where it's easy to solve, and then we may kind of run out of steam. And the political will that determines when and for whom we run out of steam, and we kind of just say, yeah, this will work for you, take it. I think those two would be the things that, from my very brief career talking to the agronomist side,
maybe have changed, set up differently in advance, such that. So I think I completely buy the analysis that we are much likelier to solve the problems that are experienced by Americans in the course of the AGI transition than the problems that are experienced by desperately poor people in other countries in the course of the AGI. Even if the problems that are experienced by Americans are way less bad, we are way more likely to solve them because those are the people who vote. Those are the people who you see when you walk on the way to work. Those are the people who are the friends and family of the people working at your company and stuff like that. This makes me want more a system that doesn't rely on ongoing, we're going to try and do transfers or something like that. But I still don't feel excited about we're going to do a big one-time transfer. Well, if I could do a big one-time transfer, I would do a big one-time transfer. But as a solution to a next major structural transformation of the economy or whatever, because I'm just not convinced that it can be sufficient to get people through the structural transformation and into the new economy or whatever.
Yeah. I think one thing that I would say here is look, if I could wave my magic wand, there's this range of policies, right? That's got kind of access to trade. I think on my list of things that we fucked up were, the number of trade barriers that kind of prevented other countries from being able to actually export effectively and kind of grow their way out of the kind of situation that they were in. And if I could wave one magic wand, that might be the one. It's around trade policy, actually. I do think it's worth differentiating between what are the different types of problems that we want to solve here. And there's one problem, which is, can you raise the floor? Mm-hmm. It's can you basically get to a point where the most kind of awful, abject, unnecessary suffering doesn't exist? And I think you can do that with a one-time large transfer, actually, or you can go a really, really long way. And there's quite good evidence to suggest that. I don't think that gets you to the point where you say these are now people who are all participating in the kind of next structural transformation of the economy. But it does mean that people are getting 2 or 3 meals a day.
Yeah.
And so I think different solutions for different problems, right? I wish I had a silver bullet for how do you structurally incentivize the, accountability, the power, the whatever it is that would face the reality that we work in nation states and that nation states have power and that nation states are accountable to their local constituents. That is just true. And I think that is always going to put at risk, whether it's the, turning off the spigot to the agricultural research or the USAID, that's a reality. One point of hope is I think that we're living at a time where actually what can be done outside of the nation-state architecture is greater than it has ever been. In terms of the ability of both individuals, but then individuals, whether it's through corporations or otherwise. And that comes a little bit back to, the greatest concentration of wealth in human history. And I would really prefer not to, rely on billionaire philanthropy. I don't think that's the solution. That wouldn't be in my top 10 list of things that I would wish as the solution. But I don't have a lot of faith in the generosity of nation states either. So I don't know.
I mean, if the more individuals there are who are in a position to individually fund ending extreme poverty, like the higher the odds that one of them will go, oh yeah, I guess I could do that.
I have a question. So there's this sort of like buzzword thing that people are throwing around, which is universal basic capital. So like, universal basic income, if you give an income in the right way, or for some people, giving them income, they'll turn it into capital, right? Like what we were talking about, they'll turn the income into productive assets. Have there been, and there's sort of like things that people frame as universal basic capital, like this Trump accounts thing, or like the GI Bill, which gave a lot of Americans access to assets through education and home and business loans and things like that. Are there studies that try and kind of do that? I know that cash is like preserves a lot of optionality and people can do a lot with it, but I'm just curious if there are any ways that people have tried to like structurally incentivize putting cash into productive assets, or like giving productive assets somehow. I don't know.
Oh boy. So the latter one, yes. The first thing to say is just like, everybody's got to understand capital is a horrendously abused term by economists, because at some point we figured out that if you frame everything as capital, you can get finance ministries to be like, oh, it's an investment in capital. Gotcha. And so like back in the day, when the classical model we all learn, you have labor and you have capital, and capital is like machines that make, I don't know, screws and grain mills and things that are big and metal and, very 1940s feeling. I think this is expanded to include financial capital, the most liquid form of capital that you can hopefully turn into all the others, but then human capital. We've had social capital for a while in like the 90s, and we've kind of no, seriously. So when I say this term is abused, and I think that's part of what it's worth being specific. So I would first really strongly agree that the idea that like the GI Bill and the availability of quality state universities in every state in the United States were UBC programs, but to a large extent, many of those are not available anymore. And I mean, if we were going to focus on the problems of the United States, probably the things I would do is try to rebuild the UBC programs, or moderately UBC programs, that we had through the period of America's greatest flourishing, when there were these tremendously generous social programs. They were largely financed by taxation. That seems to be a social contract that has started to break down, but that's how we got here. Massive government investments in R&D that ultimately can then become private companies that make people money. Those are all forms of capital the government did provide. And so I think firstly we should just say, like, this is not a new concept. That's how we got here. And from the US perspective, I would be very interested in how do we rebuild the social contract that we're going to tax people enough that, like, the University of California, State University of New York, the evidence around the amount of economic mobility from people just moving through SUNY campuses is bananas. The social mobility you get is great. So that's in the US context. I think there are a lot of studies in other contexts as well. I mean, Nick was citing one of them where the amounts, and I think this explains some of the discrepancies you see in the research on cash transfers in the US versus other countries. By and large, the amounts that we've given in many pilots in the US are UBI. They are small amounts, they will support consumption, they don't have as big of long-term structural effects because people are meeting their basic needs, and that's getting harder in a world where there's a cost of living crisis. And so the amount that we thought was going to maybe let you also make more investments is just going to paying rent and food and childcare. Overseas, though, we've got a lot more studies that are of, if it's 2 times GDP per capita, that is a financial piece of capital that people are otherwise very unlikely to have in contexts in which they don't have savings accounts. The credit markets are really, really messed up and at very high rates, all of these things. And there what we see, we're getting into the 10, 15, 20-year studies, is for what capital looks like in these contexts, which may well be goats, it may be a roof on your house, it may be the choice to move to another city, it may be greater education for yourself or your child. it's interesting. There's a very nice meta-analysis from Northwestern recently that essentially breaks out the impact by stream transfers versus lump sum transfers, which would look like capital. And you see asset accumulation, particularly for lump sum cash transfer programs, not really so much for these stream programs. And I think what capital looks like means wildly different things. I will say, though, there are 1,000,001 experiments with giving people the assets we think they should have. I mean, I raised money for like the Heifer Project in high school. And those don't do as well because we're not as good at knowing. Literally, in all the studies of graduation, I've been in multiple conferences where we had to talk about how many chickens died in Guatemala because, so this is a model, it's kind of the graduating from ultra poverty model, which is giving people a big set of complementary inputs. It tends to include a stream cash transfer, a large financial asset, usually cash, but it didn't used to be, training, like everything you could possibly want. And it's both pretty effective and really expensive. And I always think it's funny because the one from the original study published in Science, the one country where it didn't work well is Guatemala, and it's specifically because all the chickens died. Which literally, like, this is a paper published in Science. It's like a 5-year study with at least one person who now has a Nobel Prize. And like, if the success or failure comes down to did you choose the right breed of chickens, like, yeah, there's a lot of risk when we make these decisions for people. So I think there's a lot in favor of. There's a lot of things that look like capital, and that can be financial capital. That can also be human capital in the form of health. So I think that category, as economists understand it, is broad and is very well evidenced. Some of it we can do through, giving people money. Some of it has tended to come through the government services that have historically been financed by taxation, which I think brings us back to the political side of the problem.
I wanted to ask you, although we're down to the last couple minutes, so I'll try and keep it brief. We can give everybody a little bit of a chance to weigh in. Cash programs in the U.S. do not have nearly as cool effects as we see in poor countries. And you just observed that in poor countries, maybe we do the best with these lump sums, and no one has tried giving Americans lump sums that would be like the equivalent of $100,000 or something. Do you think that's the only reason why we're not seeing results in U.S. cash programs? That lump sums are better than increasing consumption somewhat, and if you really did just dump $100,000 on everybody, you'd see similarly strong results?
I don't think you'd see exactly as strong of results, because I think at a certain point you're dealing with a selection effect where if you're in an economy in which there are or have been more opportunities to get a state-funded education, and there are roads to get to, like, people who are going to have the easiest time getting out of poverty are going to have already started to get out of poverty. I think that may be changing as time goes on and some of the social safety net erodes. But no, I would expect to see not as stellar results overall, because the people you're finding in the US who are still in pretty extreme poverty are there for overlapping reasons that cash alone may not solve. The cost of living crisis, though, being one of them.
Makes sense. All right. So then, since we've just got a little bit of time, sort of last takeaways from everybody. Mine is that the thing that's going to happen by default is absolutely not going to be just for billions of people. I'm also not sure it'll be great for people even in rich countries, but there's certainly like more forces pushing towards justice in that case than in the broader global case. It seems difficult but not impossible to do anything in advance that changes that, but I'd be super excited if somebody had concrete plans there.
I think maybe one of the things, we've talked a huge amount about the impacts of the concentration of wealth that AI will create. I think some of that is perpetuated when a huge amount of the focus in the community is on applications that work, that are relevant for the people we pass on the way to work, and the people in our community, the people in the country we live in. I think it would be I like this idea of kind of riffing on the Green Revolution and saying, like, what would it have looked like to actually make that more broad-based even than it was, to make that more holistic? And I think that should really be a challenge. I'm from Oakland. I've lived in San Francisco long enough to say that, like, the amount of techno-optimism that this is going to help everybody is slowly going to give me an ulcer. But I think we're quickly going to give me an ulcer. But, like, there's so much interesting stuff to dig into that I think actually these kinds of tools can address it. We haven't talked about it as much today, but I think being so much more curious and creative there could go a long way.
Yeah. I don't want my kind of takeaway here to be. I think I've been a little bit of a kind of pessimist maybe on this stage, and I actually have quite a lot of optimism right now because, and again, I will be just honest. I'm very focused on this floor. How do we raise the floor? You know, and I do care about the other problems, but they're kind of second and third order problems for me. And I actually think that it's like more possible than it's ever been to raise that floor, and part of that is actually some of the technology that's kind of being unlocked, and it's not going to happen by default in the way that, as Caitlin says, but, you know, like we're running a grand experiment at the moment of trying to do a large lump sum, like capital-like transfer to every single person in the country of Malawi. And it's going to cost us $5 billion to do, and we've raised $250 million to do it. And we're like, you know, marching our way down that pathway. And I think like, it is a time in human history where that is like possible because of technology, that is possible because of the amount of capital that is available. And like that just wasn't true 10, 15, 20 years ago. And so there is the default pathway here does have a lot of downsides, but I think there are possibilities that give me a lot of hope for kind of raising the floor of human existence in a way that I think we should all be very like excited by.
Yeah, I think maybe one of my takeaways is similar to Caitlin's, where I think kind of around like literacy and AI literacy. I think it's like, for me, it's not like, oh, everyone needs to use AI all the time and like learn to use it and kind of pushing it on people, but more like I think it's really important that people are informed and know where it's useful and know where it's not useful for them, and to kind of be tracking that moving frontier as the industry develops. And I think it's kind of for like democratic reasons. I think people being well informed means that more people can have a say in what's going on. I think also for this sort of like capital reasons, like I think more people being like, oh, this is actually really useful for my like this thing is really good. And like also knowing where it's not useful, so that we can kind of all collectively sense make about like, okay, here's where we're actually are going to be using it, or here's where people actually do broadly find this useful, and here's where they don't necessarily. So yeah, I think like literacy is a huge part of it. I don't think we've necessarily talked about that as much today, but I wanted to bring that up. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you all so much. Thank you all for coming out here. I think that's the end of the panel part, and now we descend into the crowds and chat with everybody.